I sat down with them and, I said, how do you reach agreements here? Because they had a very centralized, rigid form of negotiation. Each side essentially just read their position papers at each other. And that was the way in which they negotiated. And I asked them, how do you break impasses? How do you break deadlocks? And they said, well, in the old days, the way that we got to agreements was we had an informal institution that we called the Wizards. And the Wizards were 2 Americans and 2 Russians who had 4 characteristics. They were bilingual in English and Russian. They were technically knowledgeable about the subject, arms control. They were lower level than the ambassador. They couldn't make any decisions. And hence, as they joked, they were disposable. And whenever there was a problem in the negotiations, these 4 would get together at some restaurant in Geneva or on the ferry boat in the lake, and they would brainstorm. They would think about, well, how are we going to count the warheads this way? How are we going to do it that way? And they came up with a lot of options, each side knowing full well that neither side had the ability to commit because both sides were under the level of the ambassador. And the joke about being disposable was that if one side went too far, you could always ship them back to Moscow or Washington and say it was all a mistake. And a lot of the breakthroughs in the arms control negotiations came out of these informal conversations. So that's the challenge that we all face in a negotiation, is we need to become wizards. We need to find ways to separate the process of deciding, which is what the ambassadors did, from the process of inventing, which is what the wizards were doing, so that everyone can feel free to invent many options. You need to invent as many options as you can. You need to go to places, perhaps, that are informal. Every negotiation needs those informal venues, whether it's at a restaurant, or over a drink, or in the corridor, or at a retreat setting in the countryside, where people can get together and start to think, what are some wild ideas? What are some creative ways of arriving at a mutually satisfactory agreement? So the challenge, essentially, is for both sides to get side by side, face the problem, and see if you can get all that gold off the table. If inventing options is about expanding the pie, there still remains the problem of how you divide up the pie. How do you deal with differences, opposed interests? What if the customer wants to buy the product for a lower price and you want them to pay a higher price? What if you want a larger size of the company budget and so does the head of the other department? How do you handle those differences? How we handle differences like that, how we divide up the pie, ends up having an enormous impact on our relationship and how we conduct the negotiation. This is the crunch in a negotiation. Usually what happens all too often is people resolve differences on the basis of will and power. Who's stronger? Who's going to dig in more? Who's going to assert themselves more? Who's going to threaten more? And the cost of a contest of will like that can be enormous. Because what happens is the issue, the problem that you're trying to resolve, goes off the table. And what's on the table then is people's egos. And the question is, whose ego is going to win? People forget about interests. They're just focused on their positions. They're not inventing at all. And the real cost is one side or the other has to give in. And you won't like to give in if it's you, and they won't like to give in if it's them. And even if you are successful in making them give in, they're going to remember it. And they're going to think about getting their revenge next time. So if the costs of contest of will are so large, what's the alternative? The alternative, what you see successful negotiators use, is they try to decide opposed interests on the basis not of a contest of will, but on the basis of objective criteria. Objective criteria like, what's the market rate for the product? What are other people who are doing the same job, what are they paid? What about scientific judgment? What about reciprocity or equal treatment? All of those are like measuring sticks. ways in which we can measure what is fair, what's a fair way to divide up the pie. So neither side has to give in. Both sides can defer to what is fair. Let me give you an example. Two friends of mine who head up two large companies in their industry. Both are very dynamic, ambitious business leaders. And they both realized that if they merged their two companies, they could make a giant in their industry. The potential synergies were enormous. But such mergers often run into the problems of personalities, egos, both individual and organizational. And in this case, the question was, which leader was going to run the new combined company? Who was going to be the CEO? And where was the company headquarters going to be located? Was it going to be located on the west coast of the United States, where one company was, or was it going to be located on the east coast? Now, these kinds of issues often break up mergers. And if the two leaders had decided to settle this on the basis of a contest of will, where each side threatened to pull out of the deal, there probably would have been no merger. And even if there had been an agreement, what kind of way is that to begin a corporate marriage? Instead, what these two business leaders did was they decided to resolve these issues on the basis of objective standards, on the basis of what was fair. So they looked at the question of who should be CEO. They looked at the qualifications of each. Both were equally qualified. But one was older than the other. One had more seniority in the industry than the other. And so they jointly decided that the leader who was older would become the CEO for a couple of years until he reached retirement age. And after that point, the other man would become the CEO of the company. The question of the company headquarters, they decided both headquarters were very beautiful and could well have suited the purpose. But they decided to settle on the basis of which headquarters was closer to the customer base. In this case, the number one customer of both companies, they were aerospace companies, was the U.S. federal government. So they decided that the company that was close to Washington, D.C. on the East Coast, that's where the headquarters ought to be. Well, the merger went through, and it became a spectacularly successful merger, thanks in no small part to the fairness with which the negotiation was conducted. So with objective criteria, neither side has to give in. Both sides defer to what's fair. It's much easier for the other side to defer to an objective criterion like market rate than it is for them to give into your position. And think about what they have to say when they go back to their people, to their boss, to their peers, and they have to explain why they decided to accept your proposal. It's much easier if they have some persuasive objective criteria to point to, like that's the way we did it before, that's the way others are doing it the same way, than it is for them to say, well, that's the most that they would give. Objective criteria not only build a better relationship, but they provide a better outcome.